So excited about episode 2 of the Election Whisperer, which is finally here. This is an episode that I have been looking forward to from the moment that I devised it. Having Rick Wilson on to the show to talk about how GOP does electioneering, which is just so distinctly different from how Democrats do it. So the episode's titled The GOP's Lean Mean Campaign Machine. Rick's going to take us through a little bit about how GOP electioneering works, the mechanics of it, how they do voter targeting differently, how they do messaging differently. And we're also going to talk a little bit about the Lincoln Project, which I know everyone's super excited about right now. And I'm honored to have Rick take us into his creative process. As you know, the Lincoln Project is moving super fast. So obviously that creative process is moving fast too. And I thought it would be cool for Rick to kind of take us into his head and tell us, okay, we've got Donald Trump doing stuff in real time and all these news stories coming out, a minute, every second something drops, and you've got the Lincoln Project responding in real time. So I thought it would be kind of cool to hear a little bit about his creative process and how those, ads are getting done. So it's going to be a great episode. I want to start off though, talking a little bit about the status of the race. If you guys caught it this week, I made a major ratings change. And honestly, it was one I just didn't expect to be making before the pandemic rolled in and the economy went with it. I was very, very doubtful that Ohio would be an attractive state for Democrats. And I think that I think that the Democrats recognized that. And I think they understood too, their refusal to make the transition in 2016 and to give up on Iowa and Ohio really cost them in the other Midwestern blue wall states. They kept dropping so much money into Iowa and Ohio, even though it should have been fairly obvious, even a month out, that they were not going to carry those states. And I think this time around, the recognition was those are states that Trump was likely going to do well in. So anyway, in my initial forecast, I did not have Ohio as a really competitive state for Democrats. And this week, based on the widening of Biden's lead in the polls, which we'll get to in a second, and the pandemic and the economic collapse, which are really powering some of that widened lead, I did move Ohio into competition. Now, I don't know that we'll ever actually, move beyond this toss-up category. I think that a little bit will depend on whether the Biden team expands competition into that state, which is true for a lot of the toss-up races. Like, if you pay attention to my race ratings, you'll know I have New York 21st, the Elise Stefanik race rated as a toss-up. That's contingent on eventually the Democrats supporting Tedros Cobb's candidacy there. If that never happens, then it will probably move back out of that category. So Ohio for now has moved up to a toss-up because certainly you can't have Biden at 10 points in Michigan. And I do actually think that Michigan is probably about 10 points, and 5, I would say, in Wisconsin, and not arguably have at least a fighting chance to win Ohio. So if you haven't already noticed that, you might want to take a look at the map, see that I've moved Ohio there, into that toss-up category. And looking at these polling averages, I think it's important to talk about because I get a lot of questions on Twitter. Hey, Rachel, didn't you say that voters aren't persuadable? And, certainly think that it's important to note, like we are seeing some persuasion effects in the data, right? And, but we also need to acknowledge like what we have is a pretty extraordinary event going on. We have a pandemic, and it's not just that the pandemic happened. I mean, the pandemic is happening all around the world, but if you've been paying attention to the COVID-19 stuff, then you'll know that America's response is really unique, right? And we were the only country in which the president chose not to federalize or nationalize the response. And now we're paying a price for that. And specifically, Donald Trump is paying a price for that politically. In the other countries, the virus got a coordinated national shutdown where everybody shut down at the same time. And then they're doing these slow coordinated reopens. And the mask issue is being treated as a scientific disease response. It's not being treated as a culture war issue. Here in the US, because of the tone set at the top, the leadership tones and the policies, our response is very different. And therefore, we have a very different pandemic, result, right? Ours is much more serious. We're looking at a death toll now that's estimated to at least go to 200,000, and that's probably by the fall. And so when you think about what's going on in terms of these poll numbers, what we're seeing is movement, a more pronounced effect among those independent voters, and we're seeing some movement amongst right-leaning independents. But I was just talking about on Twitter, the right-leaning indies aren't necessarily saying, I'm going to vote for Biden, but they are moving away from Trump into that undecided category. So we're looking at Biden leads that have been pronounced for, really as long as the generic head-to-head has been tested, which is, 18 months at this point, that were, 5 or 6 points becoming now, 8, 9, 10 points because of that effect. And so it really is, demonstrating that if you, really mismanage a national crisis, and to be frank with you, I have been also talking about this. No, I don't think any other Republican president, Democrat or Republican, no other rational politician would have chosen Trump's pandemic response, because especially in an election year where he's going to put himself before the voters and ask to be reelected, because it's an irrational response. It literally delegated his own power out to these other governors. And of course, with the Democratic governors, they're going to go with what the scientists recommend, the doctors recommend, and follow, shutdowns and mask wearing, statewide mandates, blah, blah, blah. With Trump, he's got a fairly ideological cast of characters managing some of the largest states, Texas and Florida, Georgia. And, he gave them basically latitude to do what they wanted to do. And, they're under the same pressure he is. Ultimately, the Republican base is, very ideologically rigid. And they're also getting information from, this alternative media environment, which is anti-intellectual and anti-data. So, I don't think any other rational politician would have chosen to put themselves in a position where, they could be at the mercy of these other state actors making decisions that were suboptimal in terms of outcome. And that's certainly what we have, right? We have suboptimal outcomes, 200,000 people dead. Now these states are having to shut down again. Really what these states should be doing is a full statewide shutdown again for a few weeks, and then, doing the reopen the right way. I don't think we're going to see that. So we're going to see this prolonged economic pain, prolonged high death and infection rates. It is the worst case scenario for Donald Trump, but a totally avoidable one. And of course, we'll have groups like the Lincoln Project and the opposition party reminding voters that these were not only poorly run responses, but that they were totally avoidable. I mean, that everywhere else it was avoided, and Donald Trump did not avoid it. So that's the update on that. And, like I said, if it turns out, if you start to actually, your policies are so mismanaged and so poorly executed that you're killing constituents, it turns out that even in the polarized era, voters are persuadable. So there is a little update on the race. Man, am I excited about this segment. As you know, I have been promoting the hell out of it because I have Rick Wilson, the brainchild behind the Lincoln Project ads. Lincoln obviously has been getting a ton of attention, and for disclosure, I am on the board as a senior advisor, so I should probably mention that right up front. But the Lincoln Project has been getting a ton of attention for its ads, both in the digital realm and also on Fox and other TV space for some of the better ads, where they're coming after a certain space of the electorate. These Lincoln Project guys are all former top-tier Republican campaign consultants and strategists who left the party over Donald Trump. So they're key never Trump figures, and have devoted themselves to beating Donald Trump, reclaiming the Republican Party, or at least killing the Republican Party. Some of them want to reclaim it, and some of them just want to kill it. And they have formed this amazing super PAC who's really killing the ad game, showing Democrats how to go for the jugular, how to really do advertising. Now, keeping in mind, these ads are geared at a certain audience. They're geared at independent voters. They're geared at soft Republicans, trying to convince them not to vote for Donald Trump. But they're getting a ton of attention from Democrats and from liberals for sure. A lot of the Twitterverse is in love with them. They also get a lot of attention from Donald Trump. The West Point ad Lincoln made, trolling Donald Trump about his inability to drink water or walk down the platform, obviously got to Trump. He spent 16 minutes in his Tulsa speech trying to defend his water drinking skills. So it's clear Lincoln is getting to him. Also, we know that the GOP is spending money to run ads in favorable Trump ads in DC market, which is clearly not to move voters, right? It's about keeping daddy happy and keeping his head in the game. So Lincoln's having a huge effect and a huge impact. It's really showing, I think, the left how advertising can be done effectively. So he's going to talk a little bit about that. I think it would be cool to bring have him bring us into his creative process of how he comes up with the ads. But we're also going to be talking about what I call the lean, mean GOP campaign machine, because if people who follow me on Twitter for a long time will know that I talk quite a bit about the electioneering differences between Republicans and Democrats. No one would know that better than Rick, given his career spent electing Republicans and defeating Democrats with those skills. So, I'm going to talk a little bit about, how those differences manifest. I mean, one of the things that I think is really important to reiterate is the role that turnout plays in elections. So, when we're talking about vote choice, one of the most important things to somebody's vote, really the most important determinant, is their party leaning. And that could be that they're a Democrat or Republican, or they could be a leaner, right? So I'm independent, but I lean Republican or Democrat. And in political science research, if I know nothing else about you, I don't know anything else, but I know that you're a Democrat or lean Democrat, I can predict who you're going to vote for almost perfectly every time, right? And it's always been true that party has been really important to vote choice, but in the polarized era, that relationship has grown increasingly strong and predictive. And there's a reason, because back in the old days, there used to be what we call ideological heterogeneity in the parties. So we might have had a liberal Republican and a conservative Democrat. And therefore, like if a candidate like Ronald Reagan came along, a Democrat who was more conservative might have been really attracted to Reagan. Or, if I was a liberal Republican, I might have been really attracted by, a Bill Clinton type or something like that. So we had more what we call crossover voting, and it was a little bit less reliable having that party ID predictor. But in the polarized era, what we call party loyalty, staying with one's own party, has become increasingly reliable. Not just for president, but what we call like those sub-national elections, federal congressional elections, and even down to like state legislative stuff. So my argument, or part of my research argument, really focuses on what is the party breakdown of a contest, right? So let's say we have Ohio, right? You guys will remember in Ohio in 2016, Donald Trump really beat Hillary Clinton pretty resoundingly. We were talking about like a 10-point victory. And that was pretty notable because just 4 years prior to that, Obama carried Iowa by about 6 points, a really big win over Romney. And so when you combine those two things, you're talking about a 16-point swing between two election cycles for the state of Iowa. And, one of the things that you should note is when you look at that 2012 vote, you'll see that those two numbers come pretty close to equaling 100. It's not perfect, but it gets within about 3 points. But in 2016, when we add our Clinton and Trump vote shares, we're missing like 7% of the vote. So, always when we look at the 2016 cycle, we're always going to be talking about the role that third-party defection or protest balloting played in the outcome, because, it's only about 93% of the vote explained by Clinton and Trump in Iowa. But another important element in that Iowa vote, the thing that I went and looked at when everybody else was talking about white working class voters and white resentment and, the things like diners chasing down truckers and talking about Trump, the thing that I was doing was scouring exit poll data. And I wanted to know, well, how many Democrats voted in 2016 compared to 2012. And sure enough, that hypothesis bore out, because they take, these two data points. Here's 2016 Iowa. And as you can see, like, the Iowa electorate was much more Democratic than the 2012 version. And in 2016, 38% of the electorate, a plurality, was Democratic. And, they outperformed Republicans by 6 points, right? But in 2016, that changes. That, Democrats become the plurality, get outperformed by Republicans. And suddenly, Republicans become the plurality vote group. So, when we think about what's going on in Iowa, it's definitely a story of independence, those pure indies breaking in favor of Trump. There's no doubt about that. It's definitely part of the tale. But it's also a story of that electorate's party composition changing and becoming more hostile to the Democratic ticket. So, I focus very heavily on, what does that party composition look like in the electorate? And, the reason I'm mentioning that is because, we have great data, and, not every state does party registration, but, you can get a pretty good sense of the party lean of the states. You can use polling data. You can also look at, the state's tendencies to elect Democrats and Republicans to statewide offices. But, based on this Gallup data that I pulled off and set up this Excel graph for you, you can kind of get a sense of, like, where do Democrats have, like, decent party advantages, right? And then you can also see, like, the states that are competitive. And I basically highlighted any state that had either was going to be a swing state at the presidential level or had a competitive Senate race, because I figured you guys would want to get a sense of where the party distribution is. So I even included things like South Carolina, right? And you can see, like, Democrats are outnumbered by about 10% there in terms of its party representation, right? So, when we look at some of these swing states, you can see, like, okay, no wonder they're swing states, because, there's about the same amount of Democrats as there are Republicans. And that's really a good, like, indicator that a state's going to be competitive when you have about equal party composition. It's really going to be very competitive. So, and then, we have this wonderful crystal ball analysis that was put out by our friends from Crystal Ball. You met Kyle Kondik, who was on the show last week. But this crystal ball analysis looks at the states that have hard data. So that's not survey sample. This is actual voter registration data. Because about, a little more than half of the states rely on party registration data. So we can actually look and see, where are, states that there are more Republicans registered or more Democrats registered. And you can see which states, there are more of one party's voters or the other. And it shakes out exactly as you would expect. Red states have more registered Republicans. Blue states have more registered Democrats. You might notice, though, that there are some kind of interesting things going on in there. And one state I really want you to zero in on is the state of Florida. Because you look on that column and you'll notice that Florida has just over 200,000 more registered Democrats than it has registered Republicans. And actually, that number is a little bit lower than it has been over the last couple of decades because the Republicans have been gaining ground in terms of registration. The reason being that this 200,000 registration differential does reflect a little bit what we call heritage Democrats. So that Florida panhandle that you hear a lot about is part of that southern realignment you see in Tennessee and Kentucky and Georgia and all those southern states, West Virginia, where people who call themselves Democrats because their daddy called themselves Democrats, but they actually vote for Republicans, and eventually they sometimes figure out, oh, I've never voted for a Democrat in years and years, and finally I'm going to change my registration because I move or something like that. But by and large, there are and have been for a long time more Democrats registered in Florida than there are Republicans, and this doesn't even take into account like the fact that technically speaking, especially due to the Latino populations in the southern part of the state, there are definitely more people who would vote for Democrats in Florida if they were, tracked down and registered and motivated to vote. So that's really interesting because if you have been following American politics for any time period, you might remember such episodes as Florida not being a great state for Democrats statewide for a long time. And you might wonder, well, how is it that Florida keeps going to the Republicans statewide in gubernatorial races and Senate races when there's more Democrats? I mean, that seems weird, Rachel. And especially if you think back to this 2018 cycle, right? So let's think about that 2018 cycle, especially in the context of the polling. And I especially wanted to bring this up because, as this last month and a half, especially, we've had the pandemic really kind of settle in, I think, into the electorate's mind, the economic damage and also unfortunately, the casualty damage, the health damage. And we saw, it turns out voters can be persuaded when you start to kill them, right? Even in the polarized era. So we're seeing effects from that. And then also backlash from the George Floyd murder and Trump's just abysmal navigation of that no other Republican, frankly, would handle it the way that Trump does, fanning the flames and retweeting white power tweets and the things that he does that just no other Republican would do, right? So, he has widened what I call the Access Hollywood gap, which is a gap of right-leaning independents have fallen away from approving for him or voting for him in the ballot test. And those are people who have really stuck with him through it all since he got elected. The Russiagate stuff, the Ukraine stuff, Charlotte, all of it, Charlottesville. But this thing has finally nudged them at least temporarily away from supporting him. Now we've got a long way to go to election day, right? But the fact that they hadn't budged in 4 years and they're budged now, it really is something of note, is something to be noted. But back to Florida, when we think about 2018, there was a candidate down there running for the governor's race. He was, like Biden now, was polling just absolutely huge leads. And it was a pretty extensively polled race. It wasn't like there was a couple polls and that's all we had. So that race, I think on average was like an 8-point advantage or something like that for Gillum. One of the reasons why, along with the fact that my model is constantly so bullish that Democrats should be winning Florida because of the demographics of the state, but the polls too were very bullish on the Democrats' prospects there. And then when we got to election day, Gillum got upset, right? And it didn't manifest. He instead, Rick DeSantis won the race, and it was also a loss for the incumbent Senator Nelson down there. So it was a double win for the Republicans, and it kind of surprised people given that the polling had been so much more favorable for Democrats. And I'm mentioning this because the polling failed to note what I'm going to show you. And that is that in Florida, and where Rick's going to be taking us, Rick Wilson is going to show us how and explain how this is done. The GOP state party has perfected party turnout for their, state apparatus. And when we look here, what we're going to see is, okay, I'm showing you a slide first off just showing you, okay, this is Target Smart, which is a data analytics company that does, they provide data, voter targeting data to campaigns, Democratic campaigns, very, very gold standard data. And what this is showing you is, between the Democrats and the Republicans, like what share of the electorate, did they make up in 2018? And again, keep in mind, there are 200,000 more registered Democrats, but in terms of the share of the electorate, Republicans outnumbered Democrats, and they did for all three cycles pictured here, 2014, 16, and 18. So 18, even with that big wave year for Democrats, Republicans still made up a greater share. And this next graph it's the same data, but this time it's looking at turnout, right? And what you can see is, even though the Democrats proportionally, they have a bigger turnout increase. So you can look and see how low turnout for Democrats was in that 2014 midterm. So we see this really strong increase between 2014 and 2018 for Democrats. But when you look over for the Republican turnout, it basically gets to 68%, so almost 70%. And, it's still about 6 or 7 points higher than Democratic turnout. So when we're talking about that Florida statewide electorate, Democrats, in order to win an election there, you have to overcome the fact. Number one, Republicans are going to show up and 90% of them are going to cast a ballot for DeSantis. And there's going to be more Republicans in the electorate than there are going to be Democrats. So when you think about that, it really doesn't matter if the polling doesn't have a more weighted Republican electorate. It's not going to reflect that, right? So that's one of the reasons why you might see a situation where the polling suggests a more competitive race or even a Democratic win. When you get to election day, you get a different result. And the way the GOP has done that is they have pioneered in Florida, especially, this process called absentee voting, or we're calling it now vote by mail. And this is a system of voting that really gets its roots and genesis from the Florida GOP, who discovered it, 15 or 20 years ago. I know Rick will tell us. This is stuff that I have hypothesized watching Republican politics for a long time. So, to have Rick kind of confirm my hypotheses as to how, A, what Republicans are doing, and B, how they're doing it was really exciting to me. But yeah, so they use this absentee ballot system to really pull up their side's turnout. And that's how they offset like an overall numbers disadvantage. So in other words, Republicans are outnumbered in Florida, but they make very good use of their numbers. They focus very heavily on turning out their own voters, whereas Democratic campaigns, at least until recently, have focused largely on the middle of the electorate, on what we call the persuasion bucket. Republicans invest very heavily on mobilization and use that high turnout to really offset what would be a disadvantage. So I'm super excited to talk to Rick about the lean, mean GOP turnout campaign machine, about Republican electioneering more broadly, and hear a little bit about the Lincoln Project. Okay, great. They are back at the Election Whisperer, and I am so excited to introduce my episode 2 guest. I just haven't been able to stop talking about how excited I am to have Rick Wilson, the genius brain behind the Lincoln Project ads and longtime evil henchman for the GOP, now completely on the side of the decent, the Army of the Decent, helping the Army of the Decent beat Donald Trump using his great talents to that effect. So I'm excited to have him on. We're going to talk a little bit about the lean, mean GOP campaign machine, which Rick is part of the major architects of. It's just absolutely incredible how the GOP does electioneering. I often tell people, when you look at Republican electioneering or campaign strategy, it's like watching one team play master chess, and then you look over at the Democrats and they're playing for a Connect Four. So I'm really excited to kind of illustrate what that means, and to do so by having Rick tell you a little bit about how they do it. Hi, Rick. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Rachel. Thanks so much for having me. And I just want to say, I love the fact that you're doing something where we can truly get in the weeds.
Yes, I mean that's one thing. Like I said, you know what? If people don't watch it all the way through, the show isn't for them anyway. This is for the wonks who really want to figure stuff out, and you can't explain things in 2 minutes. It's just not possible. So we're gonna just go ahead and make a show for for the few smart people out there who really care and want to know how things work. So you go ahead and tell us a little bit about how. Okay, so here let me put it this way. Go back to your days as a Republican strategist. It wasn't that long ago, but I guess it's probably starting to feel like it was. And your job was to beat a Democratic Senate candidate or a Senate incumbent, especially. Tell us how the GOP goes about running an election against a Democratic Senate incumbent.
Well, there are a couple of basic fundamentals that I always held after 30 years of experience doing this. One is the Democrats are holistically bad at politics. Now, they are sometimes great at one thing, like candidate recruitment, or sometimes great at raising money, or sometimes great at running a field operation. But, it's like the old military cliche. You can have it fast, cheap, or effective. Which one? Pick two, okay? So the Democrats rarely fire on all the cylinders at one time. And that's something that Republicans learned to exploit very quickly, starting back in the 1980s. And the long march from Republicans in the post-Watergate era, in part depended on running operational campaigns that did what they had to do, not what you thought they should do, not what you dreamed they would do. And part of that is just going out and doing the nuts and bolts work in the field, going out and doing the voter reg, going out and doing the voter contact, going down and beating down their doors on absentee and early voting, doing all the mechanical things, but also picking candidates who fit in their districts. Now, that is less the case now because of redistricting and because of the sort of Trump era we're in. But for a long time, we would go out and find a Republican who could win in, I don't know, California or Vermont or Massachusetts. And in those cases, those guys weren't ideologically perfect Republicans, but no one tried to kill them off at the national level.
Okay.
These days, you've got guys like Connor Lamb who go out there, and half the Democratic caucus is like, we're not even going to talk to that guy. Why? If he can win, who cares? He's not perfect on guns or abortion or whatever. So picking those candidates that fit in a state or a district is something that Republicans were willing to do for a long time. But the final thing, really, when it comes down to media and messaging, there's a 2 points inside of the media and messaging column you really should know. Republicans do not give a fuck what you think about them. They cannot be shamed. They cannot be lectured. They cannot be humiliated by anything. When I was on the other side of this, I was called everything in the book, every insult in the book, that I was horrible, that I attacked people, with cruel and terrible acts. Who fucking cares? Was the rule, okay? You go at the target. You don't care what they say about you. You recognize that you're not having a dialogue with other political consultants or the press. You're talking to the voters. And so just the power of not giving a shit was important.
I was going to ask you just to drill down on two things that you brought up in this first part. So you said, like, on your voter targeting thing, this absentee and early voting thing, to me, that sounds like you're talking about a particular kind of voter. Sounds to me like you're talking about Republican voters, right?
You're not just Republican voters. You're also talking about states like Florida that have a very high percentage of independent and non-party affiliated voters.
Okay.
Third party independent, we call it just the overall NPA, non-major party affiliated voters.
Okay.
In Florida, we learned that you could activate those people. About 62% of the time they would vote Republican, and all other things being control forever, all the crazy externalities, and about 62% of the time those people would vote Republican. And so you want to seek them out, you want to identify them, you want to find an issue cluster that they respond to. You want to find a way to push that issue cluster as far and as fast and as hard as you can in your absentee ballot chase, in your absentee ballot and early voting chase. You really want to push those people hard because they tend to be behaviorally amenable to a Republican-leaning message.
Okay.
For a long time, Democrats didn't do it. They thought, we're going to turn our voters out on election day.
Okay.
We're going to turn them out. We're going to get the buses and the transpo, and we're going to get everything worked out. We're going to motivate the souls to the polls. We're going to motivate the liberal activists in the condos in Palm Beach. This one election day push was always a huge gamble. And I don't think they ever really realized how much of a gamble it represented, because it's like a startup company, okay? Any campaign is like a startup. You want to do this amazing thing and get people to buy your app, to get on, to sign on to your app. Well, if you start doing it 6 or 8 weeks in advance, you can adjust. You can play with it. You can say, this message went out and we A/B tested, and this group of people, 40% return their absentees. In this group, 18%. So you do more of the A and less of the B. And because of that, you always want to be chasing them. And I want to say this about the president's objection to mail-in voting. The big objection to it that they seem to be putting out there, it's wrought with fraud. Every Republican Party in this country, every single state party, the National Party and the Trump campaign, they are all actively pursuing early and absentee voters by mail voting.
Yeah, because that's what I wanted to ask you about. Because, all right, so the reason I brought up and kind of honed in when you said, you were doing this targeting and you were talking about early voting and absentee voting is because, like, my impression, and this was, coming back to, like, when I was in graduate school, so I'm just some schmo watching elections, and I'm looking at places like Florida where, prior to DeSantis, you had Rick Scott in office, and, demographically, Florida has more registered Democrats, as we've looked at we're going to look at on the show, and should be a good place for Democrats to win. But when I look at exit polling data, the first thing that I always look at is the partisan breakdown of the electorate, and I always noticed, wow, you get these crazy turnout rates for Republicans. Like, how are they doing it? And then, as I started to research it, I realized, it's through early vote absentee balloting, right? So when I ended up becoming a forecaster and get the opportunity to meet people like you, like when I was like on Michael Steele's podcast, I asked him about things that I could ask to verify that I had thought about. So the first thing I asked you was like, hey, is it just me, or did they set up like their early vote operation to ensure really high turnout, especially of Republicans, but as you just pointed out, non-affiliates that break Republican? Because like when you look in the voter file, you seeing like 70, sometimes above 70% turnout rates of those Republican voters. So they're getting, there may be less of them, but they're getting these huge participation rates. And what you're saying is basically it's this Republican electioneering approach that they've been doing for 15, 20 years that really emphasizes not same day voting, but this long game of early voting infrastructure.
That is precisely correct.
Okay.
Look, especially because I kind of grew up in Florida politics. Okay. Gigantic state, 14 media markets, and 5 of them are in the top 20 in the country. This is a huge
expensive
place.
Right? Isn't it also really expensive? Yeah.
Hideously expensive. To be on the air in Florida right now with a message that penetrates on a combination of digital, cable, and broadcast that actually voters will really see in Florida.
Right.
It's about $2 million a week.
Wow. It's amazing.
That's real money. So when the Republicans were coming up, and it goes way back to 1994 when the party chairman, a guy named Tom Slade, who was this two-fisted, hard-drinking, shit-talking guy, was the party chairman. He had a couple guys put together a plan called Operation Sledgehammer.
Okay.
And Sledgehammer was basically a 20-year long march through the Democratic Party's institutions and ability to win in the state.
Okay.
And it focused on voter reg for Republicans, which we did for a long time, very aggressively. Now, that actually stopped in the mid-2000s, late 2000s, but that's a whole separate story. And working up programs to do absentee ballot and early vote chase. Now, we didn't have a lot of early voting when that started. We had absentee, but it's a no-fault absentee state. You can ask for absentee ballot for whatever reason. So we chased ABS for a long time.
And I was under the impression like the state party there mails out like a ballot request to all the registered Republicans, right?
Every. So it's not just every registered Republican, it's also people that we track from the voter file.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that's some brilliant shit right there, right? I mean, that's how you get it done, dude.
Yeah. And look, and I was always on the media side of things and the comms, and the strategic comms side of things. But all the guys that built this program basically established best practices for the rest of the Republican state parties. The Republican Party of Florida is the best run.
I tell everybody
the best run Republican Party in the
brilliant.
Country.
Yeah, brilliant. And also shitting their pants because Donald Trump is like basically taking their entire operation and making it like turning it into a villain, right? Like the voters hearing, don't do this thing that has helped the Florida GOP dominate Florida politics for 20 years, right? Right.
This is a real challenge for them right now.
Okay.
A few months ago, the Trump campaign went to the RPOF and said, we want to take control of everything. We want all your money, all your resources, all your people, do what we want, and also hire a bunch of our people as consultants. And even in the Trump era, the holdovers at the party were like,
hell no,
that's not great. And they all run these programs. There are some very smart consultants that run these programs.
Oh, I'm sure.
They do not, and by the way, these are not sophisticated policy fights in these absentee chase programs. They're coming to take your guns. They're coming to raise your taxes.
Oh yeah, no, that's the shit that works. It's sophistication that kills the Democrats, right? I mean, that's why they go out there with these messages that are for people with, fucking graduate degrees.
Someone sent me a Democratic mailer a couple of years ago, and every line it had like 15 bullet points on it.
Oh my God!
Read our policy plan for clean water. Read this.
I'm doing a whole special episode on that bullshit, Rick. You're gonna love it.
But Rachel, here's the great thing about it. It's a mail piece, okay?
No doubt.
And it's got long, complicated URLs for each plan printed on a mail.
I know. And you know what? They use these consultants too. Like these people are cashing in these checks, like ba-cha-ching. They don't give a shit if these people win. And then they'll be like, oh, well, we tried this strategy and it didn't work, And it's like, yeah, because you sent them this piece of shit mailers. Like, dude, no wonder it didn't work.
Look, they've had some victories in the state.
Yes, they have. And there are some good things. Like there are definitely great things. And the Democrats have made some recent, adaptions, and we're going to be talking about them next week. By the way, as a shameless plug, next week I'm having Ben Wickler on the show, architect of the Democrats' coup up there in Wisconsin, despite the pandemic when they won the state Supreme Court race. And, spoiler alert, a lot of it was early vote investment. Even before the pandemic came in, Wickler put a lot of attention on early voting. So, just to kind of give a shameless plug there. Go on, Rick.
I mean, look, if I were the Democrats, what I would be doing right now in early voting communication, I would find, you always think, never go to your enemy and ask them to do something. But if I were the Democrats in every state, I would spin up the Trump 2020 election integrity PAC or whatever.
Right.
And I would drop mail to Republicans saying, the president has said, do not vote by mail.
No doubt. Oh, I would too.
These are dangerous things. You should not do them. Donald Trump says, boom, boom, boom.
Yeah. No doubt. Well, but if I was running the D-Trip or DNC, the first thing I would have done when, Michael Steele and Rick Wilson fled the ship is I would have been like, hey, here's a big fat check. Come work for me. Yeah. But so
we're a we're
now you're a super PAC. Now you can't.
So now I can't talk to the I can talk to the parties. I can talk to a lot of the parties involved, but I can't talk to the Biden campaign.
Yeah. But you spent a long time in free agency, right? Before the Lincoln Project came along.
Sure.
Yeah, and you know what? That's probably a good time to segue a little bit into Lincoln. I mean, Lincoln, when did you guys create the Lincoln Project?
Well, we started talking in the fall of last year, and when Reed Galen and John Weaver and Steve Schmidt and I started this conversation, several things were much different than they are today. The first one was it looked like there was a real possibility Bernie Sanders would be the nominee.
Yes, right.
And none of us were particularly sanguine about that prospect because that would have been a much higher hill to climb.
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump desperately wanted, they spent money
yes.
to
Oh,
ensure
yes.
Bernie was their pick. They wanted
Mm-hmm.
to run against an 800-year-old socialist and make this election a policy choice rather than a referendum on the incumbent.
Oh,
now,
yes, definitely.
All
yes.
re-elections, unless the other side hands you the sword to cut off their head, are
Right.
a referendum on the incumbent.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
well,
we
not when you run against the Democrats, because like, here's the thing. I think the Democrats can keep the message of referendum on Donald Trump now because it's Biden and because there's a pandemic that's killed, you know, probably almost 250,000 Americans by the time we get to the fall, and because the economy's collapsed. I think that is enough to discipline them into a referendum election. But if it had been Bernie Sanders, it would have been forget about it. Like all of the Senate and all of the swing House candidates would have ran two campaigns. They would have ran the Trump referendum, and they would have ran the I love capitalism, I'm not a socialist race, right? And that's where the danger. I mean, that would have been a disaster, dude.
You would have seen 100 ads with Joseph Stalin in them and Fidel Castro.
And they would have been run by the Democrat. Those would have been run by the Democratic campaigns. I mean, I have data I collected from 2018, and none of them, like literally none. There's one. Okay, actually, I shouldn't say none. There's one Democrat that I found that ran an ad about Donald Trump. Okay, and it was Jennifer Wexton in Virginia's 10th. She ran an ad that linked Barbara Comstock to Donald Trump. Now, I did find some ads in a couple of the Senate races that talked about Donald Trump, Tester and Donnelly in Indiana, so Tester in Montana. But guess what? They talked about how they were going to work with Donald Trump. They were positive ads about Trump and how they were going to work with Donald Trump, right? Literally, so if you think about that versus like 2014 and how Republicans ran against Obama and the Democrats, like every ad was a referendum on Obama. Every fucking ad, right? I mean, so it's going to be a great, article when it comes out, because it just highlights and that's really what Michael Steele and I were talking about on their pod, because he was on an interview with Tom Perez, and Tom Perez says, we're going to make this election about local issues in each district, and we're not going to talk about Donald Trump. And Michael Steele falls out of his seat, and I'm at home, like I'm a nobody. I'm based, like my forecast had been released, but nobody knows who I am, and I'm yelling at the TV going, no, like make it about Donald Trump, right? And like Michael Steele's like, all right, he recovers himself, and he looks over at Tom Perez, and his eyes are like literally rolling out of his head, and he goes, well, in 2010, I was the Republican National Committee chairman, and I made the election all about Nancy Pelosi and Barack Obama, and I picked up 63 House seats.
This idea that you run on local issues in this environment that is hyper-partisan, hyper-siloed, hyper-politicized, and everything is no longer, it doesn't work anymore. No. Look, 20 years ago, I would have told you, yeah, be the guy I'm going to be the congressman from District X, and I'm going to fix the bridge and the roads and the water treatment plant, and that's what I'm going to do. Well, now you have to be in this national fight. Social media has leveled the atmosphere so much that you can't just pretend your votes and your values reflect you and your hometown. Yeah. Now you have to be, you're called upon, no matter whether it's right or wrong.
I mean, unless you have the Flint water crisis, like something like that, okay? Like that's obviously got the salience and the importance to override a national theme. But other than that, and in the Democrats' mind, they talked about healthcare and they won, right? So like they think, it was the healthcare that did it. Okay, well, healthcare was the central theme of every election, except for in 2018, Donald Trump also existed, right? So like Turnout didn't bump up 15 points because of healthcare, dude. It like bumped up because Donald Trump has everybody freaking out, right? And
exactly.
That was them. Classic. It was
every Democrat understood that they got a 3 or 4 point bump in that race. Yeah. In these swing districts, because disaffected Republican women
at least
had either literally
Right.
or functionally become independents, and we're
Yeah.
we're in the wind, and
Yeah.
1 or 2% of them had changed parties completely.
Yeah.
And I think that's why people love the Lincoln Project, because it gives them comfort, right? Because they know no matter what happens with the Biden team or with the Democratic infrastructure, someone is going to run a referendum campaign on Trump. And someone's going to do that in these Senate races too. Like, someone's going to make sure Susan Collins is connected to Trump, and Cory Gardner gets connected to Trump, and Tom Tillis in North Carolina gets connected to Trump. And there's a lot of people on that left side who have been looking at what Republicans do to win elections versus what Democrats do, and they're frustrated, right? And they're like, why can't we do some of this? It looks like it's so much more effective. And I think it's just been such a panacea to them. I probably pronounced that word wrong. I do that. Let my working class roots show all the time. Anyway, gives them comfort, man. It's like having a fifth of whiskey every night to go to bed with, knowing out there you've got the best brilliant minds of the GOP out there, watching the back of trying to beat Donald Trump, because it's only the fate of the free world hanging in the balance.
And I will say this, the Lincoln Project, when we came together as a group, and we've expanded, we've scaled up, as you know, very quickly. We've had a tremendous reception in several different aspects of this campaign. First off, we're closing into 1 million people interacting with us on our lists and on our socials. We're showing 10 to 12 million views now every couple of days on our media. We're out there in paid media in a bunch of the states for not only on the anti-Trump stuff, but also in the Senate races. And most importantly, what we've done, because this team works so seamlessly and we work so well to get out there in this message space, to talk to the voters we need to talk to, but also to talk to the one voter we need to talk to, and that's Donald Trump.
Yes.
The disruption of Trump's campaign. This is unique in history. This has never been done before. But we're very proud of the fact that we are able to go out there every day and get Donald Trump talking about things we want him to talk about and do things we want him to do. And it will probably never come again. You will probably never have this.
Let's hope not, right? I mean, because he is sitting in the American presidency, right, in the Oval Office with his fingers on the, and the fact that he can be psychologically manipulated by us.
There are a lot of things that led to Trump.
Yeah.
That led this country to Trump. But Trump is sui generis in terms of how a presidential candidate or president has behaved. And so our ability to reset the political dialogue by resetting what's in his head is, like I said, it's unparalleled. We've never seen it before, but we're going to keep doing that. But we're also going to keep talking. And this is a game of small numbers. And because voter files allow you to identify people in small cohorts now and to target them very well, we're going to be out there working to win the Electoral College map for Joe Biden, because Donald Trump represents such an existential risk to the country. So we will be fighting with all the tools in the toolbox that guys like Steve Schmidt and Reed Galen and John Weaver and myself and Stuart Stevens and and Mike Madrid and Jennifer Warren, a bunch of other people that we all built up over many, many years. We understand how to talk to voters with an unparalleled degree of sophistication in terms of targeting and in terms of the emotional and evocative language and imagery that we're using, that the Trump campaign, because it's all about him, has left a very wide space for us to go in and talk to those people.
No doubt. Yeah, no, I agree. And people are so hungry, I think, to see that kind of, response and messaging, that something that's, hard hitting and holds him to account, and, shows a lot of fire in the belly, because it's a scary time, right? People are looking at this election. We're counting down the days. And I got to say, I feel nervous now in June. I can't even imagine what I'm going to feel like in September, right? My refrain is got to be a blitz on every down, right? The last thing that people should ever become is complacent, because, as we've been talking about, the GOP, the RNC ran Trump's operation in 2016. So without any real campaign infrastructure, like ultimately what happened, is a story of a few things coming together perfectly. But at the end of the day, they had a good turnout operation, and it was enough with a plurality election scenario with a lot of defection for third-party voting and lower turnout and lack of enthusiasm for Clinton for him to thread the needle. So it's certainly it's an all hands on deck moment, and I'm glad to be at least tangentially related to the Lincoln Project by serving on the board. I should probably disclose that on the interview as well, because
we like having you around.
Yeah. Well, it's a motley crew, and I'm super stoked to be involved in it.
It is what we call a pirate ship.
It is, and it's a great place for people with loose morals and who are out of fucks to give, right?
Yeah, hang on, I've got my fuck giving out. Nope, still none.
I could talk to Rick for like 5 hours, but I'm sure that my producer's like, okay, we got to wrap it up. So I am so excited that you joined us on the show. I am definitely going to have you back at some point and talk more and more about election stuff. But yes, thank you so much for being on, Rick. It's great. And keep on fighting the good fight for us.
We'll talk to you again soon.
It is mailbag time. And do you realize how insane the fan response has been to this show? Just 2 episodes in, you are literally flooded with mail. We're talking Fred, Gailey, and Miracle on 34th Street dumping bags of mail onto your virtual desk. And I'm afraid there's no way we can get to all of them, but let's pick as many as we can and jump right in. Are you ready? The doc is in. And folks, please keep these emails coming. You can submit your questions or other feedback for Rachel at electionwhisperer.com, where you can also subscribe to the show, catch up on back episodes, engage with the Election Whisperer community, and so on. So the first question for this week is from James Townsend, who asks, I have this inherent worry that the Democrats will find a way to drop the ball somehow. Can you please tell me that I'm overreacting and maybe share a couple numbers with me that may put my always concerned mind at ease? I'm so ready for a return to normalcy.
Man, I wish I could put your over-concerned mind at ease, right? I think everyone feels this way that's not voting for Donald Trump. And I get so many messages, calls, pleas on Twitter, people stopping me at events, hey, just tell me it's going to be okay, right? Make the scary bad man go away. I can't give you that certainty because, as you well know, Hillary Clinton was in very similar circumstances all the way up through election night. And then, that crowd in the Javits Center, it's burned in my memory. I'm sure it's burned in many people's memories. And, so Biden's in great position, but so was Clinton, right? So I will tell you this. I have a lot of things that I'll be looking for in data. A lot of the data simply doesn't exist. I have my forecast. I have the belief that negative partisanship is going to drive a lot of people to vote that didn't vote in 2016. We've already seen that manifest in a few election cycles. You guys have largely only followed 2018, but I have had 2017 and 2019 in Virginia as well. So I've got a lot of, follow through already. And I also know that there's a lot of indicators, and we're going to be talking about those on the show. So we will have a lot of things that we can hold on to. I can make you feel somewhat better, I hope. So we'll be tracking it. And of course, talking a little bit about the things that Biden could do, or people, the groups that are trying to elect them to do to make it more likely that he can win. So hopefully this show will make people feel a little bit better, or at least a little bit empowered as to taking what they can do and doing it. So but that's a great question. And, unfortunately it's an all hands on deck type of election. I will tell you that. So no matter how big that lead is, make no mistake about it, Donald Trump is competitive to win this election.
Jonathan Taba asks, can you please explain the appeal of guys like Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and Matt Gaetz? Honestly, I'm trying to see the world through the perspective of those who think they're swell guys, and I cannot for the life of me see the appeal. Between polling data, surveys, and focus group data, can you shed some light?
Yes, this is such a great question because, It really reminds me of my class. I used to teach a political behavior class. And, a lot of people teach that class purely like voting behavior, public opinion data. I kind of taught mine in a weird way. So like we would do that stuff, but we would kind of hurry through and I would spend half the course. Like we would start off actually, I've got Republicans, Democrats, independents in between in the class. And we would start off learning the principles and philosophy of conservatism as explained by conservatives, the same thing for liberals as explained by liberals, so that each, all the students would get the best parts of conservatism and liberalism. Liberals actually, a lot of Democrats had never had that. They've never even seen like the formal theories, or conservatives have never seen the formal theories of conservatism. And then also definitely Democrats had never seen conservatism explained like in that way, and vice versa. And then we would do kind of like a deep dive into the ideological like makeup of the parties and the like voter psychology that would go into it, worldview thinking, really, really, really get into the nitty gritty. And the reason I did that is so that people like you would never really look at Matt Gaetz and understand like, okay, why do people love this guy, right? But you would at least understand a little bit of how somebody with a certain worldview, set of moral principles and moral imperatives sees Matt Gaetz one way and you see him something else. So it's a great, I always thought it was a great intellectual pursuit. It was my most popular class. And I like to think it was a good thing for students to do. So anyway, I'll try to do a thread about some of the readings that I put on that in that class.
Okay, Rachel Allen sends an interesting question. He says, Asian Americans are one of the fastest growing demographics, and they're moving away from the traditional urban cores and living in swing states such as Virginia, Nevada, and Florida. How should the political parties be thinking about this demographic, which oftentimes gets overlooked in favor of Hispanic and African American voters?
Yeah, so I mean, Asian American voters are actually really pivotal in a lot of places, and you're right, they're pivotal in many more places than people traditionally think. Though, like Orange County in the California elections, the Asian voting bloc was very important. Georgia has a very powerful Asian voting bloc, but you're right, they do get overlooked a lot, and they shouldn't, because with the transition of the GOP away from kind of a big tent party, which they really were until the mid 2000s. I mean, people forget, but when George W. Bush ran for the presidency in 2000, he ran on a platform that included, and I shit you not, at least tepid support for renewing the assault weapons ban. Okay, like, because we think about now, in Virginia, we just had, with the control flip, Democrats now control the state legislature here along with the governorship. So they passed a universal gun check bill, and they wanted to pass a gun red flag law, right? And that was like a no-go in GOP world, right? You can't have people with domestic violence not buying guns, right? So it's hard to imagine George W. Bush running around talking about an assault weapons ban, but that's how far the Republican Party has transitioned into extremism in this last 20 years. And that has also been very true for immigration. He ran on comprehensive immigration reform, as did, John McCain advocate for that up until the mid 2000s. And it started to look like it was going to tank his effort to run for president. He abandoned his own comprehensive immigration reform bill so that he could run for president. That really does, illustrate the big change, and that hostility to immigration, and also in anti-intellectualism that kind of took over the party post 2009, with the Palin pick and then the emergence of the Tea Party, that has pushed Asian American voters very far away from the Republican Party. They're actually much further away than Latino voters, and they've been voting very heavily for Democrats. So they have a very important role to play in 2018, and I'm expecting them to be pretty important in 2022. So good question.
Well, and speaking of shifting ideology, we are going to go now to a viewer named Calvin Eady, who is thinking about realignment, of course, a favorite topic of yours, Doc. And Calvin says, several states have been identified as realigning because of white working class voters moving to the Republicans and college-educated voters moving to the Democrats. What safe Republican and safe Democratic states, and he lists a number of examples, are most likely to see some sort of realignment if this trend continues?
Such a great question. I talk about obviously a lot, the realignment that's been long ongoing, really beginning, it doesn't begin actually, I guess it's a never ending process. We've had 5 and I would argue 6 party systems in American politics. And so it's always in flux. But, this realignment that we're seeing now with college educated whites moving to the left and non-college educated whites moving to the right has really redefined like the geographic power bases of the parties, because the Democratic Party used to have its power base in the rural areas, and now that's the Republican power base, and the Democrats are very powerful in the urban and now the suburban, increasingly suburban areas. And so when we think about like where were Democrats going to do well, they're going to do well in places in which the suburban areas have been dominated by Republicans. When we think about like it used to matter where the suburbs were outside of. So like in New York and Philadelphia, the suburbs were really friendly to Democrats, but in Georgia and Texas, the suburbs were really friendly towards Republicans. That is what's changing. So when we're looking at Georgia, we're looking at Texas, we're looking at Arizona, which is ahead of those two, and we're looking at this transition that's coming. And if Democrats, I think they understand it, but they don't fully understand how much potential there is in that realignment. But eventually they will catch up. And I think they're going to start to see a real potential to kneecap the GOP in Texas, because we're talking about 38 Electoral College votes. And if you can take them away from the Republican coalition, you could lose Wisconsin, right? And not even miss it. So that I think, we're really looking at potentially, we've already seen Missouri kind of fall out of, in Missouri and Indiana basically fall out of competition for the Democrats and into the Republican hands. We may see Texas joining Arizona and Georgia joining Arizona. And I think Arizona is going to be for the first time blue. And we may be looking at the day after Election Day this time, Arizona, 2 blue senators, 2 Democrats, and blue in the Electoral College.
Okay, Rachel, we've got a question here that's calling you out a little bit and asking you to back up one of your picks. This comes from Kariti Ganta, who says, I have a quick question in regards to the 2020 Michigan Senate race. According to the Senate map from this Cannon Center, Dr. Rachel Bitecofer, that's you, has ranked Michigan as a safe Democratic seat. Why is Dr. Bitecofer putting Michigan in the safe category versus other pundits placing as a lean Democratic?
That's a good question too, right? And I've really wrestled with this on my coding on my map, because honestly, Michigan and Pennsylvania are different than Wisconsin. Wisconsin is, and this is before the pandemic, Wisconsin is competitive for Trump, and Michigan and Pennsylvania were just better for Biden, and they have been, and they were always going to be. And this is a condition that has been, compounded, frankly, by the pandemic, where now Michigan and Pennsylvania are just really, really good for Biden, and Wisconsin is falling out of competition for Trump, right? And the reason is, think about it this way. In 2018, you had this host of Senate races. And, there were Senate races in both Michigan and in Pennsylvania, and nobody saw Michigan or Pennsylvania as competitive. And, if Republicans were going to be hot to trot in 2020, in my opinion, then those Senate races should have at least been competitive. So the fact that they couldn't even fire on all cylinders there in 2018 really tell me that Michigan and Pennsylvania have a huge Democratic advantage.
Well, there you go, folks. That's what you come here for. Dr. Bitecofer's analysis is often not identical in lockstep with the other analysts. And if it were, there wouldn't be too much point to this show. But not only does she offer up her own viewpoint, but she backs it up for you in real time. And I'm afraid that's all we have time for this week from the mailbag. We're going to go ahead and close it up. But please do keep those questions coming at electionwhisperer.com. We love hearing from you. And if you have not been answered yet, don't despair. There are lots more shows to come. We'll get to as many as possible. Rachel, we might need to have an all question and answer special episode one of these days to catch up with all of these insightful questions.
I just want to thank Rick Wilson again. I mean, the guy is so busy. He, I can't believe he, could give us the time that he gave us. So I want to thank him for that. Saving America, I know, is a full-time job. So thanks for coming on the show, Rick, and, illuminating us on the GOP's campaign and electioneering strategies. I'm super excited about the next week's show because we're going to have Ben Wickler on. He, again, is the chair of the Wisconsin Democratic Party and the mastermind behind the Democrats' successful capture of a long-held Republican state Supreme Court seat, and super, super instrumental to the Democrats' plans in that Wisconsin effort for 2020 for the Biden effort to take Wisconsin. Like I talked about, Wisconsin being a very, very tough race. So it's going to be a great interview. Super excited to have Ben on the show. He's a rising star in Democratic Party politics. So it's going to be a lot of fun to kind of hear from him and what he did in Wisconsin to make an 12-point rout out of that Republican incumbent. So, and then on top of that, I hope you guys are submitting lots of questions and really enjoyed the variety and complexity of the questions you guys are submitting. And I think it really shows that you guys understand that this is a show, a smart politics for smart people. And we're going to get some really good stuff out of you guys. So have a good week, and I'll see you next week.